Good evening and welcome to the 33rd Annual David R. Kessler Lecture given by CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies here at the CUNY Graduate Center. The Kessler Award is given to a scholar who has over a number, is this echoing a little bit? What do I do? This? Yeah? Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. The Kessler Award is given to a scholar who has, over a number of years, produced a substantive body of work that has had a significant influence on the field of LGBTQ studies. Please join me in congratulating the winner of the 2025 David R. Kessler Award, Dr. Robert Reid-Pharr. Robert, this is a special Kessler Award this year because CLAGS gets to welcome you back. Back to CLAGS where you were a very young board member once. Back to the Graduate Center where you were a cherished teacher, mentor, and scholar. And back to the many communities who you will see when you come up here on the stage tonight and look out, who are so eager to join us tonight to celebrate you and your work. On my own behalf, I want to thank you for your writing on James Baldwin and Black gay men, and on the meaning and making of intellectualism, all of which has been irreplaceable to me and so many people in the audience here at the Graduate Center tonight and also watching on the live stream at home. Hi, everybody. I want to welcome John Keene. And Dagmawi Woubshet. And CLAG's own Debarati Biswas, who will offer testimonials about Robert's trailblazing scholarship, his expert mentorship, and his deep humanity, which I think will be evident in his talk tonight titled Faith. This is a special Kessler for another reason. This academic year, CLAGS is celebrating our 40th anniversary. CLAGS was founded, as many of you know, in 1986 by Marty Dumerman and an organizing committee of academics and activists who were doing something for the first time. In 1991, CLAGS came to the Graduate Center, our permanent home, at the City University of New York. And 4 decades later, CLAGS continues its historic and evolving work of advancing queer and trans studies. Building on its rich history of organizing timely and impactful conferences, in this celebratory year, we are hosting 2 groundbreaking international conferences. We just finished 2 weeks ago with the Lesbian Lives Conference. Yeah. We had the chance to welcome 700 lesbians and lesbian-adjacent people to the building, including our board member, Julie Enzer, who is in the audience and who did an amazing job with that conference. In April, we'll offer a queer class relations conference, pulling from our Homo Economics conference from the early 90s. We also are expanding our fellowship opportunities this year with a $1,000 fellowship for the CLAGS Research Archive Fellowship. Last year, we launched the CLAGS Research Archive here at the Mena Reese Library at the Graduate Center, and the application for that fellowship, like all fellowships, is due on January 1st, so please take a look on our website, clags.org. Finally, last but not least, CLAGS will advance queer and trans research and training this academic year through our new Advanced Certificate in LGBTQ Studies, which is open both to current CUNY graduate students and to currently non-matriculated students. Thanks to Laura Westengard for being an incredible coordinator of that program. Which is to say that at a time when LGBTQ studies is under attack in unprecedented ways, CLAGS is expanding and enriching the field, as we have done for 40 years. So we want you to help us celebrate Robert tonight, and we want you to help us celebrate CLAGS' 40th anniversary tonight by joining us after the lecture downstairs on the concourse level for a reception. And I hope that you'll help us realize the potential of this special moment to secure the financial future of the center. You may know that last January, James Saslow, who is here with us, gave a $100,000 unrestricted endowment. And then last June, our founder, Marty Duberman, led the charge during our Pride Month fundraiser by donating $10,000 and inspiring others to give $12,000 beyond that. So thank you to James and to Marty. And to all the donors listed in the back of our new annual report that just came out and which everybody here got a copy of, and if you're at home, you can find that online. Now, I spend some of my time as ED raising money, which academics, myself included, are not that great at. But tonight, the way I want to ask you to support CLAGS specifically had nothing to do with me. The CLAGS office staff, including Yasmina and Sophia and Travis and Michael, conceived of and designed and produced a 40th anniversary calendar. And I have it here. This is the cover. This is a calendar which takes you back through the history of CLAGS. Let's see if I can advance it. Yasmina, can you advance that for me? There we go. You'll see folks that you recognize, you'll see events that you recognize, and we've given a little bit of history with all the photos. Some of these are archival photos. Some of these are more current photos. We try to explore every month. Some of the months have themes. You'll see friends that we've lost in some of these photos, but who were really important to CLAGS. Jeffrey Escoffier in this picture, and Amber Hollowbow in this picture. We relaunched the Amber Hollowbow seminars in the series in the city in her honor. Thank you. Keep going, Yasmina. Last June, we had Angela Davis here to accept our Munoz Award. Maybe some of you were in the building at that time. That was an amazing event. We celebrate immigrants at CLAGS. We celebrate trans folks at CLAGS. We celebrate all genders at CLAGS, all races. And our history is a deep one of celebration, of scholarship, and of activism. And you can buy this calendar in this special year for $20 to help us secure the future in the next 40 years. You'll see a table outside the Ella Bash Theater, and you'll also see a table down on the concourse level. We really appreciate your support at this time. If you're at home and you want to buy one of these calendars, you can go to clags.org and click on the donate button. At home, we have to charge you a little bit more. It's $30 for one for the shipping, or $50 for two. We appreciate your support. We'll send that out to you as soon as we can. I want to say a few words of thanks before I leave. Thanks so much to the CLAGS Board of Directors for their tireless work in putting this program together tonight, as well as all of our programs. If you're on the CLAGS board, can you stand and raise your hand and show who you are, please? Yasmina, can we turn up the house lights for a second? Yasmina, can you turn up the house lights for a second? Can you turn up the house lights? Thank you. If you're on the board of CLAGS, could you please stand up? Thank you to everybody at home for watching. Thank you to everyone in the audience. Thank you to John and to Dag and to Debarati. And most of all, of course, we thank Robert, our 2025 Kessler Award winner.
Hello, everyone. How are we doing? Good evening. It's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our next speaker. I'm Shomjit Ray, by the way, so forgot. I'm the Associate Professor of English at College of Staten Island and also a CLAGS board member. It's my great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, John Keene. John Keene is the author, co-editor, co-author, and a translator of a handful of books, including Love is a Dangerous Word, the selected poems of Essex Hemphill, co-edited with Robert F. Reid-Pharr, Punks, new and selected poems which received the 2022 National Book Award for Poetry. I'm not done. The Tom Gunn Award for the publishing, from the Publishing Triangle, and a 2022 Lambda Literary Award for Gay Poetry. And counter-narratives, stories and novellas, which received an American Book Award, a Lannan Literary Award, and a Wyndham Campbell Prize for Fiction. He has translated poetry and fiction from an array of writers, including Brazilian author Hilda Hill's novel, Letters from a Seducer, which was republished in a revised edition by Pushkin Press in 2025. He's also a 2018 MacArthur Fellow, so he's a genius. He's a Board of Governors professor and has served as a department chair and program director at Rutgers University, Newark. John. Please welcome John Keene.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. I want to begin by thanking CLAGS, its executive director, Matt Brim, its board co-chairs, Terrence Wooden and Debarati Biswas, the CLAGS board and staff, my fellow introducers, and everyone involved in making this event tonight possible. I also want to thank all of you in the audience for attending tonight's event, both here in person and virtually. It's an incredible honor to celebrate the one and only, and there is one, just one and only, Robert F. Reid-Pharr, and I'm profoundly pleased and honored to be able to sing his praises. Congratulations to Robert on being selected as this year's David R. Kessler Lecturer. Originally, when I began drafting these remarks, I thought I might focus primarily on his foundational work in LGBTQ studies, Black studies, and women's and gender studies, and detail his brilliance, his rigor, his erudition, his originality, his fierceness, and his genius, a term which I did not think it a stretch to invoke in terms of Robert and his scholarship, but I thought it might be more interesting if I gave a little personal history on how I came to know Robert, who remains a dear friend, as well as an intellectual pole star for me, and a model for how to be and live and thrive in academia and the world. So I hope you will bear with me as I take us on a stroll along memory lane, so to speak. It might have been around 1988, so I'm dating myself, not Robert, that a dear late mutual friend of ours, Gerard Ferguson, first told me about and then introduced me to Robert. Gerard, who also introduced me to CLAGS and later played a role in my joining the CLAGS board for a brief period in the late 1990s, was detailing for me the many stellar fellow graduate students he had encountered while in the graduate African American Studies program at Yale University, a number of whom, unsurprisingly, have gone on to illustrious careers. And one person he singled out was a certain North Carolinian native named Robert Reid-Pharr, who he noted was not only super smart and possessed of an unmatched sense of humor, but able to hold his own whether in classes, social settings, anywhere. He did not say, but I would soon learn, and I can say this because I know Robert would appreciate it, that Robert was cute. At some point after that, I believe I met Robert at an event Gerard hosted in Somerville, Massachusetts, and that was the start of our friendship, which has thankfully endured to this day. Robert was, as Gerard assured me, super smart. He most certainly could hold his own in any company. He had a sense of humor that to this day can make anyone fall out of their chair in laughter. All right? And I also saw his profound intellectual and scholarly dedication and diligence, leavened by thoughtfulness, kindness, and care that would carry him through his doctoral program and which have been hallmarks of his amazing career. When I finally had the opportunity to read his scholarly work, I deeply appreciated the critical depth and analytical rigor of his readings, expanding my sense of how impressive a thinker, critic, and scholar he was and is. One early culmination of his intellectual and scholarly work was his debut study, the still dazzling Conjugal Union, the Body, the House, and the Black American, published to acclaim by Oxford University Press in 1999. Reading this book would bear fruit for me not only in terms of my thinking and teaching, but in a work of fiction I would publish a decade and a half later. Robert was among the first few out Black gay doctoral students I came to know. He was one of the first I knew to successfully defend his Ph.D. He was one of the first I saw landing postdocs, fellowships, and his first job at a major research university, and among the few I knew who successfully made it through the tenure process. At many steps along his academic journey, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to hang out with him, whether in Washington Heights, through whose streets he fearlessly strolled with his locks in a tight bun, a fishnet bag slung over his arm, talking of Cheryl Clark, serving, or Philadelphia, where we kikied and took the train out to Swarthmore, where he was teaching, or Baltimore, where he and his then canine companion, Trixie, and I think I got this right, I think Trixie was in Baltimore, served as my guides through that city's somnolent streets, or DC during the annual Black Gay Prides, and later back in New York City, among the many stops in his exceptional career. And I was able to repeatedly observe how he managed to maintain his poise, wit, and sense of self, his scholarly focus and dedication to his teaching and mentoring, and his interest in creating a life in the world that, I think it is fair to say, would serve as a model for me and many others. I also was and have been able to witness his work not just as an academic, but as an advocate for LGBTQ people, a champion of colleagues and students, a scholar, a critic, an administrator, an editor, a cultural leader and cultural worker, in dialogue with writers, artists, and activists, and as an out Black queer intellectual and person in the world. To give a few examples, I think immediately of Robert's dialogues across time and media with figures like the great thinker, writer, theorist, and activist Samuel R. Delany Jr., who was himself a Kessler honoree some years ago in 1997, and on whose behalf I believe both Robert and I offered introductory encomia that year. Early on in his career, while still a graduate student, I think, Robert conducted a thought-provoking interview for the Black Diasporic Arts and Culture journal, Callaloo, with Chip Delany, that later was included in Delany's nonfiction collection, Silent Interviews, on race, sex, science fiction, and some comics. And I was really impressed that Robert was able to have this dialogue with Chip, who I adore, but I was like, I could never do that, right? At least not back then. And Robert would go on years later to write his perspicuous forewords to the 20th anniversary edition of Samuel Delany's remarkable work of queer history in New York, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, and an authoritative afterword to Delany's haunting novella, Phallus. I also think about Robert's path-blazing second book, The Wide-Ranging Black Gay Men Essays, for which Samuel R. Delany returned the favor, writing a sparkling introduction, issued in 2001 by NYU Press, and the Publishing Triangle's Randy Schultz Award winner. And how many times I reread its essays, finding something new and rewarding in them each time. I think about how a colleague, now a leading figure in Black studies, mentioned to a group of graduate students and fellow junior scholars at a conference a few years after the book had been published, how Black Gay Men Essays had proved to be a revelation for him and utterly expanded his sense of possibility about what scholarly, critical, and autobiographical work in and around Black and queer studies might look like, and how it might be reconceptualized and written, noting how Robert had put himself fully into the text in an accessible and open style while sacrificing none of the rigor and insight that were hallmarks of conjugal union. I vocally agreed then, and reviewing Black Gay Men not long ago, concur even more so now. I also think of Robert's stewardship of Transition Magazine, the legendary international diasporic journal of thought and art founded as Transition Magazine, an international journal by Rajat Nyogi in 1961, and on whose masthead literary titans, including Wole Soyinka and the late Christopher Okigbo, among countless others, have served. Now published by Indiana University Press for the Hutchins Center at Harvard University, Robert served for several years as its editor. And on his watch, the journal brought in a vibrant board, which I was fortunate enough to be a member of, giving me an up-close view of Robert's skills, not just as an editor, but as a leader. Under his tenure, the magazine launched a new website, published issues that spoke directly to the moment, and hosted the biannual Nyogi Lecture in 2023, honoring the late Guadeloupean writer Maurice Condé. Among his final important acts as editor, supported by the board, was an attempt to have the magazine issue a statement on genocide in Gaza. Lastly, I think about Robert's multi-year engagement with Black LGBTQ writers like the late Essex Hemphill, one of the most important Black gay poets of the late 20th century, with whom he remained in contact until the end of Essex's life. As Robert has noted in a forthcoming interview, he had long hoped to honor Essex's wish to be remembered and celebrated, and so it was a major fortuitous turn that Robert and I ended up working on the collection that would become Love is a Dangerous Word, Selected Poems, published by New Directions earlier this year, and the first book-length publication of Essex Hemphill's poetry since his passing in 1995. I can say that it was a delight to work with Robert, even amid the challenges we both faced, with work schedules, the particulars of editing, and our aims of ensuring we conveyed Essex's vision and presenting him at his best. And I urge that you get a copy of this collection not only to immerse yourself in Essex's poetry, but to read Robert's extraordinary foreword, which could easily be a freestanding biographical essay about Essex in its own right. It exemplifies so many aspects of Robert's brilliance in an accessible form. In these brief remarks, I've only scratched the surface of Robert's achievements. As most of you know, he's the author of two more acclaimed books, Once You Go Black, Choice, Desire, and the Black American Intellectual, NYU Press 2007, which manages to have both one of the best titles and sexiest covers of any scholarly book I've come across in recent years, and whose pages, as Robert's work always does, brim with his usual perspicacious, cross-disciplinary argumentation and return you to the books and authors he's writing about. And Archives of Flesh, African America, Spain, and Post-Humanist Critique, NYU 2016, which utilizes post-humanist critique as a means of exploring the extensive but still mostly unknown dialogues between African-American and Spanish artists and intellectuals, including Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, Federico Garcia Lorca, and Pablo Picasso, among others. Throughout his work, I note a number of through lines, including his post-theorist exploration of Black queer subjectivity, selfhood and self-fashioning, his rethinking of the Black intellectual and activist traditions, his interrogation of white supremacist narratives of Black being and becoming in the world, and his transformative, transdisciplinary approach to literary scholarship. His work has, as many here can attest, and continues to be both foundational and generative. Again, there's so much more that I could say, including listing Robert's numerous honors and awards, among them research awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a Guggenheim Fellowship, fellowships from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and the Bogliasco Foundation, the Matthiessen Visiting Professorship in Gender and Sexuality Studies at Harvard University, among many others. But I will conclude by congratulating him again on this amazing award and stating publicly, he's still cute.
Thank you, John. Good evening, everyone. I'm Prabheshika Datta. I'm a Ph.D. candidate of economics at the Graduate Center here. I'm in the board of CLAGS. It is my honor to introduce Dagmawi Woubshet. Dagmawi Woubshet is the Edmund J. And Louis W. Kahn Endowed Term Associate Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of Calendar of Loss, Race, Sexuality, and Mourning in the Early Era of AIDS, and co-edited a volume, Ethiopia, Literature, Art, and Culture, as a special edition of Callaloo. In the Calendar of Loss, Woubshet rethinks the cultural history of AIDS era, showing how Black and queer artists transform elegy into aesthetic and political practice, one that renders grief as a generative form of memory, kinship, and critique. Across his scholarship, he examines how aesthetic form of registers the entanglements of race, sexuality, and affect how literature and film turns loss, intimacy, and endurance into forms, structures of relation and imagination. His writing is marked by conceptual clarity and emotional depth, revealing how form can bear witness to histories of dispossession while opening space for collective life. His work has shaped how readers, artists, and critiques think about entanglements of race, sexuality, and form in the late 20th century and its afterlives. His essays and criticisms have appeared in Transition, ENCA, Journal of Contemporary African Art, The Atlantic, The African Lives, and Anthropology. He is currently at work on a scholarly monograph, now No Ways Tired, James Baldwin and the Art of Late Style, a book of personal essays, A New Flower, lyric essays. Woubshet has served as an associate editor of Callaloo and currently sits on the editorial board of Transition. He has held fellowship at Civitella Ranieri in Italy and Africa Institute of Sharjah at the UAE and Modern Art Museum in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where he curated Julie Meretu, the Addis Show. Before joining the University of Pennsylvania in 2017, Woubshet taught at Cornell University, where he was named one of the 10 best professors at Cornell. Woo! He received his Ph.D. in the history of American civilization from Harvard University and BA in political science and history from Duke University. Please.
All right, good evening. Hello. Thank you so much, Probeshka, for that generous introduction. Matt, it's great to see you. I first met Matt now over a decade ago when we both served on the board of CLAGS, so it's wonderful to be back here in this space. Thanks to you, to CLAGS, the staff, the board. What a joy to be here and to join Debbie and John in congratulating our beloved friend, a scholar we treasure, Robert Fitzgerald, Reid-Pharr. The first time you meet Robert Reid-Pharr, as was the case for me, and I'd imagine the case for many of you, is an encounter very hard to forget. Mine is indelible. They're clear as day in the dark memory bank where I safekeep occasions like this, because in our very first exchange, Robert Reid-Pharr said to me, Dagmawi Woubshet, I don't mean to be cantankerous, but it is April 2004, 100 blocks north of here, at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Robert is one of the invited speakers to discuss and to celebrate the life and work of Bruce Richard Nugent, the Renaissance writer, painter, and illustrator, best known for his marvelous maverick short story, Smoke Lilies and Jade. Robert shares the stage with the writer Samuel Delaney, the historian David Lavergne Lewis, and two others I can't seem to remember now. After 20 years, also hard to recall the presentations with detail, although I can still conjure up the electric feeling in the room, enlivened especially by the words of an incomparable literary artist, a powerhouse historian, and a hotshot young intellectual. Then professor at Johns Hopkins University, whose second book, Black Gay Man, was on everybody's shelf, save, regrettably, mine. Of that day, I have a clear picture of Robert Fine, sporting a high-top fade, sitting between Delaney and Lewis, and another clear memory, what he said to me. When time came for Q&A, I queued up to ask, no, to moralize in the way the young can do sometimes, about the white beauty so idealized in Smoke, Lilies, and Jade, a question anxiously voiced, crudely phrased, mistaking narrator for author for one, and even more crude, in tone at least, if not in words, throwing shade at Nugent's apparent desire for white men. Robert takes the mic, and before offering a response, he asks me first, hey, sweet, what's your name? And sensing my nerves and my bluster and the general design of the question, he asks also, are you a student? I respond with all my Ethiopian Black nationalism on my chest, my name is Dagmawi Woubshet, yes, I'm a doctoral student. Without skipping a beat, Robert replies, well, Dagmawi Woubshet, I don't mean to be cantankerous. Then goes on to offer an eloquent disquisition on how we must heed a work of art's aesthetic prerogatives, especially when they jar against our critical judgments, moral hang-ups, blinkered visions. And what if the object of desire is a white man in this story, in Nugent's life? So what? You have got to be more nuanced and more rigorous than the quality of your question. Robert was explicitly and implicitly saying, you have to expand your scholarly repertoire, examine your blind allegiances. There I was, standing with the mic in one hand, other hand wiping off sudden sweat gleaming on my forehead, one ear captivated by what was an exemplary, teachable moment, the other ear still stuck on Dagmawi Woubshet. I don't mean to be cantankerous. You can imagine, even if said affectionately, these words can be disquieting for a young, insecure graduate student, and the sound criticism that followed easily misheard and mistaken for clapback. Thank heavens, I received all that he said that spring afternoon in the same generous, critical spirit it was tendered, because of his honest, humane address, and because of the fleeting but meaningful gesture he extended my way, how he asked and said, like a fluent Amharic speaker, my name, my full name. That simple effort, that simple act of recognition was so disarming, so humbling. It meant I could actually listen to what he was counseling, absorb his criticism instead of seizing up or becoming defensive. It meant I could begin to learn. I begin with this anecdote to help frame Robert's iconoclastic intellectual temperament and what I discovered soon after meeting him, reading his work, first and immediately, Black Gay Man, Essays, then Conjugal Union, The Body, the House, and the Black American, and later, as they appeared in print, Once You Go Black, Choice, Desire, and the Black American Intellectual, and his last book, Archives of the Flesh, African America, Spain, and Post-Humanist Critique. Now, add to this inimitable catalog of books, scores of beautifully wrought essays in scholarly journals, art catalogs, and literary magazines. Ambitious, rigorous, idiosyncratic, erudite, iconoclastic, historically expansive, conceptually discerning, always written with style, and scandalously so when need be. Robert's body of work represents the finest example of literary and cultural studies scholarship we have on matters of race, gender, sexuality, and the American character. No one else has written about 19th, 20th, 21st century Black life and art, about the intricate overlays of race, gender, and sexuality over the sweep of American history and life with the same breadth and depth as Robert has. There is an unmistakable thread in Robert's writing, a set of conceptual and ethical questions that have guided his work to date. What is Black? Who is Black? What is Black writing? If you have a fixed answer to any of these questions, Robert's work is sure to disabuse them real quick. When theorizing what he calls the prehistory of the African American novel in the 19th century, Conjugal Union, or the intellectual makeup of mid-century and post-war African American writers, Once You Go Black, or the intimate liaison between Spain and African America in the early decades of the 20th century, in each book, at each turn, Robert fastidiously appends any absolutes we have come to harbor about race. Not only unsettling easy formulae of Blackness prescribed from without or from within a Black world, but also revitalizing our thinking and scholarly protocols so that we don't just reify, repurpose, and reproduce the normative logics of race and other identity markers in spite of our best aims to undo their warped and warping design. This is no easy matter. Or, put another way, it's an easy matter to resolve if it were a mere rhetorical and conceptual exercise independent of the complexity and contradictions with which we actually think through and live out our lives. Reflecting on his larger intellectual enterprise and his iconoclastic intellectual temperament, Robert writes in Black Gay Man, quote, "Much of my work, much of the work included within this collection has been straightforwardly designed to help dismantle the American identity machine, to break its hold on the collective imagination. Yet, strangely, I find that, like many of my peers, I continuously use the mechanisms of that machine to effect its dysfunction," unquote. All right? What I love about Robert's work, from Conjugal Union to Archives of the Flesh, is that it strives to articulate new lines of inquiry that, in fact, bust wide open our thinking. I can't help but recall, for instance, the provocation he puts forward in his first book, Conjugal Union, about the very formation of the African American literary canon, going against the well-established scholarly consensus which views Phyllis Wheatley as progenitor of the tradition. Robert observes, quote, "The simple fact that Phyllis Wheatley was an author of African descent, that she existed within a purportedly Black body, should not be enough to secure her status as the originator of the Black American literary tradition," unquote. It's an observation that will have any student of Black literature gasp, pause at least with indignation or sweet satisfaction at the heresy of it all, pause with confoundment, which gives way to wonder, to conjecture. How else we investigate the relationship between what he calls the Blackness of Black American literature and the Blackness of the Black American body, unquote, which, however interlinked, are not one and the same. What Robert goes on to achieve in Conjugal Union, then, is to shift the very ground for assessing the link between Black life and text in the 19th century, casting a critical eye on how domestic, interior Black spaces were so vital for the emergence of Black subjectivity and Black fiction making, an intramural domain that engendered race outside the invisible, hypervisible public positioning of Black people. How prescient certainly for a book published in 1999, to make this important conceptual maneuver towards theorizing Black interior life as a fecund site for the co-production of the Blackness of a text and the Blackness of a body. Indeed, such deliberate critical swerves away from the expected into an unthought terrain is a hallmark feature of Robert's work. Think of how he hones in on the language, idea, and ideal of choice in Once You Go Black to read major writers like Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin against the grain, brilliantly, counterintuitively, figuring choice not as a concept from which Black people have been historically excluded, an obvious point, but instead, in fact, as a concept through which Black writers have envisioned and enacted a much more expansive conception of freedom. With an exquisite reading of John Williams's Roman Clef, The Man Who Cried I Am, a seldom read, discussed work which introduces Once You Go Black, Robert illuminates how choice, however estranged it is from our thinking on Black culture, in fact animates Black life and serves as a powerful counterpoint to what he calls the racialist nonsense that so overburdens our culture. For the ability to choose is the ability to opt out. Either way, choice is a stay against what Robert calls Black inevitability. Quote, one might not only choose one's room, one's books, one's music, and one's sexual partners, but also, and important, one might choose one's identity, indeed, one's race, unquote. I love Robert's self-reflexive voice, not only in his more personal essays, but more generally, the searching, seeking, self-questioning voice that animates all of his scholarship. How he works out an argument for pages and then, like that, revise and complicate that position with volte lines like, I have been long skeptical about an argument you just, sketched out for 2 pages, or I have become increasingly alarmed about the very cogent argument he's just presented. And I love lines of self-caution, doubling as advice to the reader, like this one. We risk the charge of hypocrisy if we offer only more and more sophisticated expressions of the anthropological gaze, unquote. These moments of self-revision, caution, contradiction, invite the reader not only to engage in a similar form of critical self-inquiry, but also, as he says, quote, to grope for a method by which to bridge the divide between theory and practice, to break down barriers between the ways in which one thinks about American life as a professional critic and the manner in which one comports oneself in one's everyday passings, unquote. I'm nearing the end. Indeed, we all have much to learn from Robert's scholarship and how we might bridge what is an untenable divide between our professional and personal lives. How we might align our critical and erotic selves and imbue our work with pleasure, however that pleasure manifests itself. Reading Robert's work, that pleasure for me comes surely from those carefully, sensually crafted sentences, inasmuch as his brutally candid portrayal of his own desires. Remember what he tells us about the motivation behind titling a book so audaciously, Black Gay Man. Beyond registering a quick shock, it stemmed from what he says, quote, the visceral, self-concerned, self-pleasing basis for much of my activity as a left intellectual. Observing the broad landscape of our scholarship and American culture at large, Robert says again in Black Gay Man, quote, yet a sort of dull, heavy silence falls most often around the politics and the pleasure of what we are doing, the humdrum perversities of our existence, the way we fuck. Our sexual politics tend most often to be trivialized into pornography or returned to darkness by an obscuring set of theoretical practices that demonstrate an incredible squeamishness about both sex and politics, unquote. Black gay man is exceptional in this regard, exemplary in its brilliant uses of the erotic in the service of a scholarly enterprise. And well before we heard of auto theory, this was the book that opened up new possibilities of what the scholarly essay can do for so many of us in Black and gender and sexuality studies. We are grateful, Robert, that your work fills us up with critical insights as much as it does with pleasure, both nourishing and enlivening, not just what we do, but how we live. So much to say, so little time, like how you've kept faith to that generation gone too soon. Your brilliant essay about Essex, including also the foreword in Black Gay Man, and also the foreword in the volume you edited with John. Your brilliant remembrance on Marlon, and more broadly, those brilliant Black artists gone too soon. Also, your minor essay, but so major, that one of the first to write to think about Kara Walker's work, which remains also the best. How under your editorship, Transition, a long-running Black literary journal, you have produced extraordinary issues, especially the issue on climate, on species, and on queer Uganda. You are a consummate scholar and writer for whom I have the utmost admiration, trust, respect, and love. And you are my beloved friend who inspires me how to live bravely in the light. Let me end with this. A short anecdote in which my full name shows up again. So Robert and I are dear friends, and so when we talk on the phone, pouring tea, dishing this and that one, and often I'm telling tall tales about either an amazing sexual encounter or a very dull one. And he'll listen quietly and then say, Dagmawi Woubshet, you know what you are? Hot in the ass. Well, I learned it from you, Robert.
Hello, my name is Terrence Wooten. I'm an associate professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College, and I'm currently the co-chair of the board of CLAGS. And as the co-chair, I'm going to do a thing that I told everyone else they weren't allowed to do, which is I'm going to slightly go over 2 minutes, because it is this introduction for the next testimonial speaker, because it's a joy and honor to introduce my colleague and comrade, Dr. Debarati Biswas, who we will affectionately refer to as Debbie. Debbie is an assistant professor of African American Studies and coordinator of the Black Visual Cultures minor at the New York City College of Technology for you CUNY people, that's City Tech. She's also a faculty fellow at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics here at the Grad Center and the co-chair of the board of directors at CLAGS. Working with Debbie on the CLAGS board over the last 3 years and as co-chair this past year, I've seen how her rigor and generosity make study feel like shared work, intellectual, infrastructural, and deeply humane. She's the rare kind of scholar who can be knee-deep in a theoretical debate 1 minute and making sure everyone's having a drink the next. That same sensibility, the belief that care and critique belong together, runs through everything she writes and all that she does. Across her essays and collaborations, including her recent co-edited special issue in Women's Studies Quarterly, Unbearable Beings, which she co-edited with Laura Westengard, who also is on the board, Debarati returns to a central question: how Black and queer people cultivate livable worlds amid the architectures of racial capitalism, whether theorizing the aesthetics of the unbearable, tracing rituals of endurance in carceral spaces, or reflecting on the political stakes of education. She treats art not as illustration, but as method, showing how love, fugitivity, and coalition generate infrastructures of care when the state withholds them. All this culminates in her book manuscript, which she is diligently writing and for which we are all patiently waiting, titled The Perpetually Unsettled, Aesthetics of Elsewheres and the Queer Politics in Black American Literature and Culture, 1954 through 2018. Conceptually, the book frames unsettledness as an aesthetic and political condition, an orientation through which Black queer writers transform constraint into creative method. Reading mid-century pulp and popular fiction from authors like Chester Heinz, Clarence Cooper Jr., and Iceberg Slim, Debbie shows how the carceral and the erotic are entwined, how scenes of captivity and dispossession became laboratories for alternative modes of feeling, relation, and world-making. She ultimately theorizes an aesthetics of elsewheres, a poetics of movement and improv that treat rumor, touch, sex, and care as techniques of freedom. Against the moral and affective strictures of Cold War liberalism, she illuminates how Black expressive culture models other ways of being and belonging, how imagination under pressure becomes both survival and theory. Debbie also insists that scholarship meet the world. Her public writing and public books in Teen Vogue brings that same clarity to broader debates, and her collaborative media work, co-producing the award-winning docu-fictional series 3 Trembling Cities, extends her intellectual commitments into new forms. Debbie serves on the editorial board of Women's Studies Quarterly, and her work appears in the forthcoming Bloomsbury anthology, The Parasitical Logic in Culture and Society, edited by Peter Hitchcock. Her public and institutional work share the same ethic that runs through her scholarship, a refusal to separate study from struggle. As a fellow CLAGS co-chair, I can attest that she's as brilliant in planning a meeting as she is on the page, someone who can quote Hortense Spillers and build a spreadsheet at the same time. She reminds us that theory is not just something we write, but something we practice together. Of course, no short introduction can capture the full reach of her work or the texture of her presence. Tonight is, at best, a glimpse. But it's enough to say that we're in the company of a scholar who makes you think harder, listen closer, and believe that rigorous thought and genuine care belong together, a conviction that, unsurprisingly, she carries forward having been a student of Robert Reid-Pharr. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Debarati Biswas.
Well, I was going to say I was raised in the institution of Robert Reid-Pharr, but I should add, I feel I have been nurtured in the institution of my co-chair, Dr. Terence Wooten. Thank you so much. It's a great honor for me to be here and to be part of the celebration of Robert Reid-Pharr's singular work and contribution to gender and sexuality studies, Black studies, American studies, cultural studies, and Black queer studies, or shall I say queer Black studies. Borrowing Robert's tribute to Essex Hempel's in the foreword to Love is a Dangerous Word, selected poems by Essex Hempel, co-edited with the great John Keene here, I should instead say, I know that though Robert's talent is certainly unique, it is hardly singular. His name is always mentioned in sentences crowded with proper nouns. Though I often hear the words Robert and genius in the same phrases, I just as often also hear Kathy, Samuel, E. Patrick, Marlon, and Roderick. I want to reiterate what Mark Anthony Neal said to Robert on his show, Left of Black. Robert, you're part of that cohort that helped, at least in the academy, to create a field, Black queer studies. You're indeed an OG in this field, Robert. I've known Robert for almost 2 decades now. Yes, we were both born somewhere else, in another country you can say, but we both chose to grow old in this marvelous city, and certainly, in my case, this building, this remarkable public institution. I'm fortunate to say that Robert is my mentor, professor, dear friend, in some, my chosen family. I still cherish the day when Robert called me in the old-fashioned way to welcome me to the English department at the Graduate Center as a doctoral student. I had read Black Gay Man by then and was blown away by the clarity, beauty, and the beat of almost every sentence. I will go ahead and say that Black Gay Man was really my first introduction to US literary theory and criticism that I was able to read, understand, and yet get transported and transformed. And all that happened without having to lose my bearings in sentences that were as long as full paragraphs with clauses that really could have been their own sentences and, done their own thing. Those razor-sharp and sexy sentences helped me make sense of my own becomings in a place that was not yet home. That phone call did begin my lifelong journey within the walls of public institutions and my own work. I don't mean to suggest that it was also easy and simple. Being a Ph.D. student in literary studies, that too, an international grad student of color from a working class background even before these openly fascist times, was and is always hard. At least in my case, it meant making a choice, conscious or not, to be broke for too many years, forever exhausted, forever doubting if they understood what I just said. In other words, it really meant struggling to make my newly stamped identity an alien, also somehow familiar and sexy all at the same time. But I'm glad to say Robert managed to beat all those how-tos out of me by just holding doors wide open for me and so many others in my cohort here, present here, and refusing to close them even when he saw me debating whether or not I should enter through those wide open portals. I was taking Robert's African American Literary and Cultural Criticism course in the fall of 2007, and after class one day, he held one such door open, and I almost didn't go in. Robert had just published his field-setting book, Once You Go Black, Choice, Desire, and the Black American Intellectual with NYU Press. I had just started reading it as well in order to understand what sorts of questions I should be asking in a class full of very smart American students, some even from the local Ivy League. I was pretty sure that I had nothing smart to say because I thought I was too clumsy and didn't quite know how to articulate all those big ideas that were warring in my head and pleading to be let out. I thought I had managed to keep them all quiet and avoid getting caught as the imposter I knew myself to be, but Robert decided to blow my cover after the class. As we were all waiting for the elevator on the 4th floor in the building, Robert popped a question, an offer that any grad student would jump at. Robert said, "Debbie, the department is doing a launch event for my book. Would you like to moderate the conversation about my book?" I froze, and instead of saying with a confident air, "Sure, I would love to," I replied with some version of, "Are you sure about that? You really think I should be up there moderating such a conversation with you and Eve Sedgwick and also Samuel Delaney?" In my head, I had begun to doubt Robert's judgment of things. Actually, I was certainly not his A+ student. After all, that was always my Indian benchmark, which I was failing badly to live up to while teaching 3 classes and barely being able to pay rent and also managing to eat at least 2 meals every day. As I was struggling to rescue my initial awkward response, a smart American peer stepped up and offered to be the moderator instead. I think that's when I came to my senses and offered to share the role with my peer. Such is Robert's process. he manages to not only find a place in the academy for himself, but also knows how to see through the institutional blinders and hold doors open for those who are still struggling to figure out how to navigate academia and to get access to rooms with doors that can be closed and also opened. Robert's first book, Conjugal Union, published in the same year as Munoz's Disidentifications, makes a very important intervention into Black American studies by reassessing the work of antebellum Black American intellectuals through the lens of desire, choice, and post-colonial critiques of the nation and nationalism. Robert, I would argue, inaugurated the possibilities entailed in studying Black American literature as a queer literature from its outset. Robert explores how the household was utilized by Black American writers to normalize the relationship of the Black body to the community such that a person could enter a household as a white and leave as a Black, to quote from the synopsis of the book. With this book, Robert begins his scholarly journey of analyzing Blackness as that which indexes all those desires and values that cannot be contained within the discourses through which households and nations are constructed. In Once You Go Black, the book that really launched my own intellectual journey, Robert asks, quote, "What would happen, what worlds would collide if students of American history and culture were to take seriously the idea that we all possess agency and indeed choice," end quote. Robert explains it this way, quote, "Blackness is perhaps the most tradition-bound product that this country manufactures, and evinces that, quote, Black American is not produced at the location at which the African was dehumanized, at the point at which he becomes a racial slur. Instead, the Black American is produced at precisely that moment at which the attempt to dehumanize the African is met by the equally bold attempt to resist that dehumanization," end quote. Robert's point is especially generative given the popularity of theorizations in schools that continue to center the exceptionalization of trauma and refuse to imagine otherwise. In Archives of Flesh, African America, Spain, and Post-Humanist Critique, published in 2016 by NYU Press, Robert contends that the field needs to finally come to terms with the fact that it is yet to recognize the modes of articulation of those who are often defeated and exist at those locations thought to be outside of society, the dirty and the impure, the benighted subjects of modernity and postmodernity who, quote, "were never more eloquent than when they were bartering their own flesh, their own human potential," end quote. My first book project, tentatively titled The Perpetually Unsettled, I think Terence did a better job than what I'm doing, cruises the possibilities and portals opened by Robert's field-generating oeuvre. I want to conclude by saying that Robert has been everything I could have hoped for in a dissertation advisor and more. He complimented my work when it was not the best and showed me its potential. His unwavering belief in my work, in spite of my many procrastinations, has helped me claim a small room in the academy. I have benefited from his ruthless encouragement and creative instruction, and I want to echo what he wrote when signing my copy of Archives of Flesh. Robert, you are a gift. Thank you, and congratulations. I will now speak as the co-chair of CLAGS and read out Robert's official bio, but I think we are running late, so I'll just say you heard everything. But Robert F. Reid-Pharr is professor of social and cultural analysis at New York University. He holds a Ph.D. in American Studies and an MA in African American Studies from Yale University, as well as a BA with honors in political science from UNC Chapel Hill. He has many, many awards. I cannot wait to hear what Robert has to say today, but it is such an honor to welcome Robert back to his home, one-time home.
I actually can't close my mouth. I'm very, very moved. I'm very, very, very moved. I'm so grateful. I think I'm a plenty smart guy. I do. Wait for it. Wait for it. But I think it's almost never said to people never say the thing that I like best about myself, and that is that I'm amazing at bringing together rooms full of geniuses and rooms full of marvelous people. So I don't fret in the world because I have all of you to look at and to enjoy. Thank you so much, Debarati. Thank you so much, Dagmawi. Thank you so much, John. I'm so embarrassed. None of the things that you had to say seemed at all logical in relation to me. But I'll accept that. And I also wanted to thank the audience. I'm in a good mood. I am. I'm happy about Zohran Mamdani having become the mayor of New York City. That's a good thing. Oh my goodness. Oh Lord. And Democrats winning in other places. And I'm a piss poor Democrat, so this is as much as you get. I'm going to read a piece. It takes almost exactly 45 minutes. It's in two parts. Both parts work, not necessarily together. I know how bitter the days have become. I know the suspicion that perhaps something unstoppable has arrived. I know the fear that politely friendly neighbors have turned clumsy and savage. I know the grim panic that rises up when one begins to fret that the particular vulgarities of this particularly vulgar moment are here to stay. I know the feel of paranoia itching its way ever more deeply into ripening bone. I know the rage, I know the dread, I know the loneliness, I know the shame. I know the irritation of being forced to listen to yet another old man counsel patience, diligence, steadfastness, and faith. Yet here I stand, counseling patience, diligence, steadfastness, and faith. To speak bluntly, my heels pressed to the ground. As an American, I am much less concerned about the thieving and incompetence embedded in our national government than I am by the ever-creeping sense of despair, cynicism, futility, and a sort of necessary callousness and opportunism that suffuse so much of our politics and our culture. The idea of the beloved community, the dream of a diverse, multiracial, multi-ethnic society with profound regard for the rights of so-called minorities, including members of the LGBTQ population, is under deliberately vicious attack. The raids, the deportations, the deployments, the firings, the festivals of public humiliation are certainly efforts by the country's executive to take full control of all aspects of the federal government and to harass the president's political rivals in the process. There are also, however, pointed attempts to rewrite, indeed to deform, already brittle norms of public engagement. The images of our neighbors being cuffed, beaten, rounded up and herded onto buses, with the cameras always fretfully rolling nearby, are designed first and foremost to discipline us. We sit in our homes, hands cold, faces hot, learning that we are the types of people who allow such things, that the certainty of who we are is maintained by men in masks proudly displaying their abilities with pepper spray and zip ties. Authoritarianism is not fashioned simply through the careful deployment of ideas, nor even the brute force of the military and the police, but also through the expression and manipulation of everyday norms of style and behavior. Our culture continually tells us which lines can and cannot be crossed. That is old news. What I would like to remind us of now, however, is the simple fact that cynicism and fear cannot defeat cynicism and fear. This is though the attacks on the commitments and forms underwriting our sense of community continue to be grisly. Indeed, there's an enormous amount of work to be done defending the institutions that service the needs of our many peoples. What I want to draw attention to here, however, are the equally destructive attacks on the very sense of community, what might colloquially refer to as our Americanness, that have become a central strategy of the current administration. Again, the deportations, the raids, and the ungainly deployment of National Guard troops are televised for a reason. Of course, these images feed both the sense of rage and desire for revenge that underwrite so much within the contemporary conservative movement. At the same time, these actions play a keenly important pedagogical role. They remind us of our dissatisfaction, our regret, our angst, and perhaps most importantly, our alienation. If you and I, dressed in our dignity and desire, are not responsible for the excesses of the nation, then who is? Who will wear the mantle of redress and rehabilitation for not only those who are continually being harmed, but also for the many Americans who support authoritarian politicians and the clumsy ideas that those politicians peddle? How does one confront a wolfing demon if we, in fact, have neither common languages nor common procedures with which to announce and actualize the ideals that we presumably hold so dear? What I'm asking for is that we take a moment to consider what we imagine coming after crisis. In the impending contest, can one offer a vision of the future in which our most valued ideals stand easily alongside the everyday complexity and contradiction of our communities? Stated bluntly, how can Americans rebound from the ugliness of today in order to reproduce our societies and their publics in ways that allow us to value our differences, indeed to flaunt them, while also guarding against the tribalism and cynicism to which we are so pitifully vulnerable? I contend here that in attempting to provide an answer to that question, we need to consider the nature of faith. We need to examine as closely as we can the mechanics of how we hold it together, not only across space and time, but also across differences of conviction and custom. I should rush to say that when I speak of faith, my concern is not primarily with the theologies and ceremonial practices of the many religious traditions that have taken root in the United States. Instead, my goal is to encourage us to think through the mechanics of how faith and faithfulness operate in our culture, including in our religious culture, so that we might use those techniques in order to encourage forms of civic faith, hope, tradition, and commitment that embrace radical complexity and multiplicity. I want, that is, to respond to the fear, hatefulness, and resentment that so plague us by examining and deploying already extant discursive and ideological tools that privilege the promises and possibilities of shared beliefs, ideals, and practices. Thinking about the function of faith in U.S. culture, particularly Black religious culture, I want to focus less on the content of the claims made within our faith traditions and more on their methods, particularly their habits of repetition and reformation. Close to 75% of the African American population self-identifies as Christian. Another 7% or so are members of other faiths, particularly Islam, making us one of the most religious communities in the so-called Western world. We are, in fact, a people of great and expansive religious belief. The obvious question, however, is what the nature of that belief actually is, and relatedly, how might we narrate the theological and organizational complexities of our various faith traditions with clarity? Certainly, it must be admitted that for the descendants of enslaved people, the examples of bondage and redemption that stand at the heart of Christian belief have been and continue to be particularly inspiriting. I must admit, however, that I'm always confused and a bit vexed by the glib ways that African American spirituality and religiosity are described. Presumably, the 40 million or so of us, having formed our Christian religious traditions and slavery, cling to them even today as forms of inspiration and sustenance. In the process, Black religious practice is often understood either through a sort of two-dimensional appreciation of its aesthetic qualities, those grand traditions of preaching and music, or highly flattened and mechanistic understanding of the role of Black religious life in the civil rights struggle, the spirit of which might be expressed by just 4 words: I have a dream. Still, my focus is on how we might revivify a sense of community and civic faith that is under renewed and ever more vicious attack. Thus, my griping about the stale ways in which Black Christian religious practice is often represented in popular culture is motivated by a desire to help imagine a revivified public sphere in which difference, including religious and ideological difference, is understood to be necessary and beneficial for the proper functioning of state and society. I will admit to being influenced by the insights of Jürgen Habermas in his work Religion and the Public Sphere, in which he argues for a vital and legitimate role for religion in the social, cultural, and political lives of even so-called secular societies, while also pointing out that there are remarkably few examples of a clear dividing line between Western statecraft and Christian ideology. In the United States, Christian religious references and practices are especially prominent in our everyday interactions with the state. All that taking of oaths and expressing our trust in the one God reassures Christians that their beliefs, though muted, remains a dominant force. Their belief, though muted, remains a dominant force in the society, while continually reminding Christians that the basics of their own religious or non-religious ideals might be easily disregarded. My point is not, however, to enter into old, if deeply necessary, arguments about the profound Christian bias that underwrites so much in our culture. Instead, I want to draw attention to the ways in which the current right-wing onslaught against the American people is indeed an attack on the practices and procedures of what I have called our civic faith, the faith in our governments, our institutions, our sciences, our bureaucracies, our communities, our neighbors, and yes, our religious institutions. One might rightly claim, in fact, that lack of faith has become its own sort of commodity. Cynicism has become the proud calling card of the right, while what passes for the left often articulates itself through ever more complicated narratives of resentment. Regardless, the world remains divided between us and them, and the very idea that we might imagine, much less achieve, the beloved community is all too often derided, especially by so-called progressives, as the last gasp of an impossibly unsophisticated idealism. I will simply have to take the bait. Following clumsily in the path of Habermas and his many students, I will leave my religious kin to their beliefs. Instead, I want to tap into the power embedded in the claim that not only are we all kin, but that the instruments of our kinship are ancient and never-ending. Indeed, that our words and actions are always in conversation with not only the past and the future, but also with those unknowable aspects of human presence, cognition, and feeling that can be accessed only through one's recommitment to a community that exists for the most part outside one's own conscious existence. In particular, I want to take seriously the role of ritual and communal self-expression in the articulation of community. On the day of my father's funeral, I sat in front of his coffin in the first row of a tiny church packed with my grieving kin and listened to my loved ones lie. The congregation's first house of worship had been built in 1850 on land gifted to enslaved people by the members of the smugly handsome white Presbyterian church that still stands in all its grim forgetfulness just down the road. The Presbyterians had become tired of sharing their attractive building with enslaved people, so they gave them land while leaving the actual construction of the sanctuary up to the Negroes and their God. The church never became particularly large, but nonetheless it endures. The wooden building that I remember from my childhood was never knocked down. Instead, when it could no longer be used, the congregants simply built another structure beside it and allowed the old one to sink into the ground. Throughout my childhood, I was reminded that slaves were buried in the yard beside the building, thus the softness of the earth beneath our feet. Eventually, the property directly adjacent to the church was bought by some enterprising black entrepreneur and turned into what subsequently became a quite successful and now quite full black cemetery, the very ground in which both of my parents and many of my kin are buried. Later, sitting beneath awning at my father's graveside, I looked for a moment at my sister sitting beside me just before we both stood, walked to the coffin, and kissed the box in which our father would presumably be sent to heaven. It was enough. I want to repeat the need for all of us, particularly those of us who consider ourselves progressives, to develop not so much a theory as a critical practice of faith. Most of the particulars of the ceremony that I have just recounted were wholly familiar to me by the time I sat stiff-backed beside my father's coffin. We sent him home with all the protocols intact. Here, however, I invoke the ritual as part of my effort to reconsider the proper form and function of faith and faithfulness in public culture. I see value in the ceremonial reaffirmation of one's commitments to the larger community, a community that also includes the ancestors and the yet-to-be-born. I also know that formal rituals work not simply through their strictness and severity, but also through the disruptions and slippages that strictness and severity provoke. Near the end of the ceremony, a woman with a perfectly round face and short, tight reddish-brown hair waited in line to greet the mourners. When she finally got to me, she bent and asked if I would speak to her privately after the service. I agreed and later met her in the yard. She told me that she was my relative, a member of my grandfather's family. The only problem was that I had never met my grandfather, nor had my father. His paternity had been a mystery all his days. Still, I did in fact believe this woman. I'd seen that reddish-brown hair and those dark gray eyes staring out of my father's round face all my life. The woman looked very much like him. That is why what happened next so surprised me. I told her that though I fully sympathized with her suffering, I did not, in fact, value what I think she took to be blood truth. My father and I were spawned from a series of accidents and tragedies, but my kin, the people who had raised me and my sister, who made a path for us and who held this very land as a refuge, were right over there, standing around in the yard, dressed in itchy clothing and trying not to cry. My allegiance was to them and not to some never-to-be-seen grandfather or great-grandfather going all the way back to the first captures and rapes. My response surprised me, and even now I regret the mixture of pain and blunt recognition in the woman's eyes as she left. I was lost for a moment. I felt as if I might drift above the strangeness of what I had just done and never return. Aunt who held me down. She walked up, tall and dark-skinned, looking nothing like either me or my father. She told me that there was food waiting inside and that she had a question. She wanted to know if my friend Herman, who had arrived all the way from New York and whom she described as that good-looking, curly-headed boy, was just a friend or my special friend, because if he was my special friend, she wanted to get to know him. I thought to myself, lesson learned, and returned to the sanctuary, hungry for the repast. We desperately need to think through and exploit the mechanics of loyalty, reliability, and commitment. We need to reconsider faith not as a thing complete and whole within itself, but instead as a series of deliberate procedures by which one trains and focuses one's energies and commitments toward the needs of the larger community. Moreover, we need to get moving with this process as quickly as possible, as part of what is underway in the United States today is a deeply cynical attack on our always weak sense of community, the very sense that allows American people to live together without ripping each other to shreds. Here, I would like to point for a moment to the work of the legal theorist Dean Spade, who argues that the focus in LGBTQ movements on rights-based narratives, which all too often center the concerns of exceptional individuals, has most often allowed for the advancement of already relatively privileged persons without affecting the less privileged, less scrutable majority. In the meantime, the everyday lives of trans and genderqueer people are most often affected by their contact with administrative law, matters surrounding identification, birth and death records, travel permits, marriage licenses, adoption orders, and death benefits, represent the most common ways in which the majority of trans people confront the hostilities and vagaries of the state. Thus, Spade insists that both our theory and our politics ought to remain sharply focused on those mechanisms by which identity is ordered, governed, managed, and controlled. My own addition to Spade's extremely important intervention is only to suggest that we should also remain focused on the everyday forms of ritual practice that suffuse all of our communities, not simply so that we might celebrate and support those practices, but also that we might use their logical, ideological, and aesthetic structures in order to help imagine the forms of democratic community and renewal for which we so long. One comforts one's kin, polices the narratives of one's genealogy, and performs one's ritual obeisance before failed patriarchs, not because these things are logical in and of themselves. Instead, one does these things because in the doing, one might better access and negotiate the actual world, our lived reality, in a manner that might allow our most cherished values to endure even as they are continually bat-heard, challenged, and harnessed to an ever-proliferating variety of tasks. This is, in fact, what I mean when I use the term faith. The repetitiveness, the clumsiness, and the artificiality of the rituals that I have described may not always be attractive, but they are very often practicable. 2. I will admit that though I'm intrigued by the idea of adopting modes of communal reaffirmation found in African American religious life to the needs of the larger secular community, I cannot be exactly certain how that adaptation should operate practically. What I do know, however, is that this type of inquiry is hardly new. On the contrary, I've spent the majority of my career studying the work of the author and activist James Arthur Baldwin, largely because of the fact that he was one of the first intellectuals whom I encountered who dared to name the impossibly intricate relationship between religion, sexuality, identity, community, and activism. Indeed, Baldwin was as keen an observer of what I've called the mechanics of faith as any American intellectual whom I've encountered. In making this point, I would draw your attention to a particularly precious piece of Baldwin's archive, the unpublished treatment for a never-completed novel tentatively titled No Papers for Muhammad. I turn to this especially valuable piece of Baldwin's ephemera because in it, the maestro is relentless in his pairing of religion and sexuality. I want to suggest, however, that this pairing represents something more than a need on Baldwin's part to reveal submerged truths about the nature of our religious lives. Instead, I believe that what he was attempting was exactly the type of boundary crossing and genre bending that I'm suggesting are vital if we are to find ways to reproduce and reiterate a progressive sense of community, of communal belonging, and to profit from the democratic project together. I suspect, moreover, that part of the reason that Baldwin never completed No Papers for Muhammad had to do with the work's remarkable ambition, the ways in which it amplified the maestro's long-held conviction that sexuality and religious belief are co-constitutive, indeed that the practical mechanics of religion and sex are remarkably similar. In No Papers for Muhammad, Baldwin repeats a story that had appeared already in both his final novel, Just Above My Head, 1978, and his remarkable 1985 Playboy essay, Freaks and the American Ideal of Manhood, in which he reports being molested as an adolescent boy in the stairway of a Harlem building. We reached, perhaps, the second or third landing, and the man stopped and turned and looked down at me, and then I realized that he did not live in this house, Baldwin remembered. He said that James was a cute boy and touched his face, his eyes getting darker and his face closing before he put his hands on James's pants, causing the boy's cock to jump before kneeling and taking it into his mouth. The scene ends when, hearing sound coming from one of the landings above, the man finished with James, pressed some coins into his hand, and retreated into the street. Knowing that something at once novel, exciting, dangerous, and awful had just happened, the frightened child rushed home, thinking that he would never be clean again, and that there was no one on earth who could help him. I locked myself in the bathroom and threw the money, a quarter and 2 dimes, out of the bathroom window, Baldwin writes. No one had ever told me anything about sex, and I therefore not only felt that I was dirty, but I knew that I was lost. Not too much later, I entered the church. Following the narration of his molestation, Baldwin then precisely describes the several erotic encounters he had while he was a boy preacher. One of the reasons I entered the church was because of my love for a boy whom I will call Ned, Baldwin remembered. The two boys should, quote, have been making love, discovering something real about each other, end quote. And Sid Baldwin admits that he quickly became so holy that no one would have dared broach such a topic with him. Still, the boys' erotic connection was undeniable. Ned's father was a parking lot attendant, and his son often came to relieve him during the night shift, giving James an excuse to leave his home, pouring coffee and sandwiches to damp his friend's hunger. One evening, just as James arrived, Ned put a finger to his lips and snuck with his friend in tow beneath a parked Ford so that they could listen to the creaking, the moaning, the complaints, and the yelps of a couple fumbling through sex. The car rocked. My cock against the rocky ground got hard. I looked at Ned, who was absorbed, and did not look back at me. As I repeat the fact that there is no place in Baldwin's oeuvre in which he is more thorough and revealing about his sexuality, particularly his homosexuality, as he is in No Papers for Muhammad, I must hasten to note again that many elements of the work were related or reiterated elsewhere. The ungainly interplay of sex and spirituality is very successfully described in Go Tell It on the Mountain. The story of Baldwin's molestation was divulged in both Just Above My Head and Freaks in the American Ideal of Manhood, a work in which Baldwin also relates the story of a teenage affair that he had with a man 22 years his senior, a story that he repeats in No Papers for Muhammad. In the latter instance, however, Baldwin offers a much more in-depth and precise treatment of the relationship, one that is concerned from the very start with the ways in which church and sex were never distinct realities. After a hideous fight with his father, a 15-year-old James rushed from his family's apartment into the insult of the New York winter. Getting as far as Central Park, he decided to turn home, fearing the deadly whiteness of the snow and the even deadlier whiteness of the trigger-happy communities living below 125th Street. Shuffling glumly back to his family's apartment, he became aware of trailing footsteps as he passed Lenox Avenue and 130th Street, nearby the Church of Mother Horn, who, when upon meeting James years before, had asked brightly, "Whose little boy are you?" Always the clever child, James understood immediately that the footfalls padding behind him that bitter evening were themselves urgently whispered questions come threats. "Whose little boy are you? Whose little boy are you? Whose little boy are you?" Conspicuously, in his retelling of the story, Baldwin never indicates that he was in the least afraid. Instead, he imagined his pursuer as another in a string of men hoping to catch sex from naive adolescence. Men had accosted me in these streets before. Why don't you let me suck that big, beautiful cock? And I didn't want to go through it again. Making a final turn toward home at 133rd Street, and still unable to confuse or discourage his hunter, James decided to enter another small church, one he had been forbidden to visit, but that squatted in the middle of the block in which his family lived. Climbing the steps and entering the church, he found it packed and rocking. People were singing, shouting, and dancing in the aisles. Standing there, still sluggish from cold and fright, the hesitant teen was jostled by a shouting woman. Putting his hand behind him to steady himself on the back of a pew, he placed it on the hand of the very man who had been following him and who had been bold enough to track the boy into the temple. The person to whose face Baldwin dared to turn his prominent, always searching eyes was about 38, handsome in a Spanish high yellow kind of way, tall and on the heavy side, with bright, black, mocking eyes and a small mustache. He found James's surprise and incredulity gently amusing. Both pursuer and prey were stunned by the ridiculousness of the situation, the ways in which the practices and procedures of the church worked to draw them together. The boy's impulse was to run, yet he could not spring himself from the trap of the intruder's gaze. He felt beneath him the springing rhythm of feet pounding the floor in rapturous precision, and lost not so much his will as his volition. Even as an efficient, no-nonsense usherette hurled both James and his stalker into the same pew, literally on top of each other, the boy remained cornered and silent, caught in the magic of obscurity, awe, dread, and undefeated wonder that is the true power of both religious belief and sexual desire. "Why don't we get out of here?" the man Billy finally asked. James rose and silently, if not obediently, followed him into the night. As one reads Baldwin's account of the pair's arriving at the entrance to Billy's building and climbing the stairs to his small furnished room, one's mind returns immediately to the scene of the boy's molestation no more than 4 years earlier. This time, however, the adolescent had taken on at least some of the trappings of the man he would become. He'd started to smoke when he was outside of Harlem, so he readily accepted Billy's offer of a cigarette. And where James later remembered his first sexual encounter through a lens of fear, confusion, and disgust, he described this meeting as gentle and precisely choreographed. As the pair walked through gray-iced streets, James took pleasure in Billy's arm draped around his shoulders, the gentle press of a stranger's thickness against his own tight form. Later, sitting in Billy's room, a rectangular box furnished with a table, a chest of drawers, 2 chairs, and the battlefield of his bed, the teenager was offered his first drink, brandy, on which he choked. And then the offering, the call, as the Christians would have it, was presented to a still uncertain James. He took me in his arms and kissed me, Baldwin remembered. I had never been held in that way before, never been kissed that way before. First I melted in gratitude, which was not yet pleasure, and then I froze in a panic meant to forestall pleasure. It is in no way surprising that the boy panicked. Even as Billy pulled him into the raptness of his form, a wall of refusal rose between them, and James struggled from the man's grasp, beating a quick and decisive retreat. No, I said no, and I ran to the door and ran down the steps and ran all the way home. If I didn't remember what my father said, it's because it no longer mattered. Immediately regretting his decision, Baldwin began incessantly seeking what he had lost. I began to look for my lover everywhere, haunting the streets where I thought he might be found. I did not dare to go to his home. Winter turned to spring, and spring to summer, and one day, just before or just after I turned 16, I turned a corner at 125th Street and 5th Avenue and bumped into him, and on that day, I had not been thinking of him at all. The unlikely pair, small and large, black and brown, an adult, again retreated to the impossible security of Billy's room, where in their first encounter they were forced by the punishing cold to cling one to the other, to accept the elemental solace of animal warmth. This time they swam together through the percolating heat of the Harlem summer, both of them sweating, open, panting for relief. They walked to Billy's house, climbed the same stairs, and entered the same room. Billy poured James a brandy, and then the two took their seats as James picked up a magazine and began flipping it through it with guarded nonchalance. After a bit, Billy said, "I bet your mind is as much on that magazine as I am in Chicago." Then Billy pulled James into his lap and found himself aroused again by the boy's thinness and delicacy, what in clumsier, less genteel times we might have referred to as effeminacy. They were both excited. The spark between them created by the clumsy pairings and forbidden crossings that framed the awkwardness of binding a 38-year-old man and a 16-year-old boy. And I was not afraid when he opened my trousers and took out my cock and kissed it and sucked it and put his tongue down my throat again. Even as surprising as this description of what we might think of as the beginning of Baldwin's life as a mature sexual being may be, what is more startling still is Baldwin's contention that Billy's desire, or perhaps better put, the unevenness of the desire shared between Billy and James, was the very thing that gave the young artist the freedom to write. It was not that Billy especially enjoyed fiction, or that he was in any sense whatsoever literary. Instead, Baldwin describes Billy as just another Harlem hustler. Nonetheless, the 16-year-old relished the fact that the man was proud of him, that he showed him off to his friends, and looked at, though likely never read, his apprentice work. At home, there was no one to see the miracle that was happening in the body, mind, and spirit known as James Baldwin, no one willing or capable of developing something approximating pride in the boy. I could not in that point in my life have lived without that man, Baldwin remembered, and I must say he was extraordinarily nice to me. Billy was a bridge for James. He helped to ease the way from adolescence to manhood, Harlem to Greenwich Village, the diction of the pulpit to the slared articulation of the speakeasy. Stating the matter more savagely still, Billy taught James the delicate art of how to make an exit. Their initial departure from that church on 133rd Street would give the young writer his first true taste of deliberately turning his face toward the beckoning world and answering its call. The boldness of their actions taught James, and perhaps Billy too, that the way forward was not to deny the contradiction that suffuses all life, but instead to embrace it. The couple maintained their relationship for at least 2 years, continuing even after James departed Harlem for the village. It ended, however, soon after Baldwin returned to bury his father, who had died just before the famed Harlem riot of August 1943. Ever the gentleman, Billy worked assiduously to help secure James's future, finding him a job in the post office that he supposed would help in the Sisyphean task of supporting James's mother, Bertus Baldwin, and her many children. James rejected the idea out of hand, claiming that there was no way under heaven that this plan could ever work. He believed that the safe route that Billy offered him, days toiling under the burden of letters and packages, nights toiling under the weight of Billy's distracted flesh, would lead him down the same path of resentment, frustration, and radically delimited possibility that underwrote the madness that eventually overtook his father, David Baldwin. I would end up like my father, and they would all hate me as much as they had hated him, Baldwin complained. It was all or nothing, quitte ou double. I had to jump, so I jumped. And that was the end of me and Billy, who had sweated his ass off, finding a job for me, but his pop-eyed baby was long gone. What is the greater strength? When one first looks into the face of a stranger, witnessing the miracle of a billion imperfections, seeing there the union of impossibility and beauty, One draws on a courage that always hides itself, that masquerades as curiosity, inebriation, boredom, or lust. And when one kisses that stranger, smells up close the shock of unfamiliar human scent, one necessarily trembles before the sheer force of mind and spirit that it takes not to run from the seam, a force that, as all the great poets remind us, might spark the founding of civilizations, or at least the launching of ships. Yet when one leaves a lover, when the memory of a, quote, blunt Spanish cock, end quote, is overtaken by the image of, quote, a drunken, sweating, despairing face, quote, end quote, of a man standing on the sidewalk in front of your apartment and begging you to come back, one's courage returns again, but this time uncloaked, naked, reminding you that the teary-eyed suffering parading before your still and unblinking face, the painful burden that stoops and contorts a once straight and beautiful back, is not yours to shoulder. James explained that Billy had been the only thing that had ever happened to me, and that he had been in the main, alas, something that had happened to me, like a landslide. He had loved Billy, and they had slept together because Billy had liked it. James did not yet know if he liked it. Pleasing Billy was all. If Billy had wanted me to take up armed robbery instead of making love to him, I might have taken up armed robbery instead of making love to him. I might have taken up armed robbery and never noticed the difference. Here, Baldwin dares remind his readers that poor, skinny, terrified, and queer, as he presumably was, he was hardly a victim. In the precise language of the streets that reared him, he was nobody's punk. Like the saints in the temple, he needed to jump and shout. I should pause for a moment to repeat my contention that not only do we desperately need to imagine forms of what I have called civic faith if we are to move forward as a community, but also that we might very well profit from closer examination of established forms of ritual, including religious ritual, that seek to reaffirm our commitments to each other, our comrades, and our kin. Thus, I have turned in No Papers to Muhammad, this spectacularly cloistered piece of James Baldwin's oeuvre, not only because I see it as a remarkably frank discussion of the intimate relation between religion and sexuality, but also because it is easy for me to see the ways in which the manuscript operated for Baldwin as a sort of ritual device, a place where he could examine the ways that even our most cherished practices are always tethered to the most basic of human needs, the need for companionship and indeed sex chief among them. I would like then to expand my arguments by acknowledging that though I have pushed for the need to take religious ritual seriously as we attempt to reiterate the ideals of community and belonging which so many of us hold dear, I also believe that we should privilege the forms of erotic and sexual ritual that one regularly finds in many parts of the LGBTQ community. In clubs and bars and baths and parks, on dance floors, at festivals, standing beside counters and standing beside graves, we regularly worship and sometimes pray. My point in these comments is not then to encourage a return to respectability politics, but instead to look at the ways in which our ritual practices can usefully trouble the line between good and bad, black and white, man and woman, straight and queer, whether those ritual practices originate in the praise house or the party house. That is to say, we are right to attempt to create a world in which ritual and faith, both the sacred and the civic, are designed first and foremost to expand radically what we mean when we use the term human. Finally, I will end by making an unsubstantiated and perhaps unfair claim about James Baldwin's state of mind as he worked on the treatment for No Papers for Muhammad. I suspect that Baldwin never completed the novel because he was scared. It is not simply that it describes a sexual relationship that he had as a teenager with a man 22 years his senior, or even the molestation that he suffered as an adolescent boy. Instead, I imagine that what really frightened James Baldwin, and perhaps stilled his pen, was the insistent way in which he channeled his descriptions of both sexual exploration and abuse through his equally compelling descriptions of the religious communities in which he lived. In No Papers for Muhammad, Baldwin makes no particular distinction between sexuality and faith. Instead, I suspect that Baldwin's goals in No Papers for Muhammad were at least formally similar to the ones that animate my own comments here. The maestro wanted to examine the everyday boundary crossings between the profane and the sacred, sex and religion, because even at the end of his life, he was attempting not so much to reveal new ways of understanding human experience as to uncover and exploit the ways that already existing modes of understanding could be put to radically new purposes. Or to return to the spirit of this essay, I believe that what Baldwin was modeling in No Papers for Muhammad was a type of promiscuous intermingling, particularly in our cultural lives, that are essential to the project of reimagining the beloved community. James reminds us, even in his failures, that we desperately need to revivify our sense of communal belonging by paying attention to and perhaps even celebrating the fissures, ruptures, splits, and cracks in our culture where belief meets desire. We need, that is, to try to imagine a democratic community that can encompass all of us and all of that. Thus, we must reimagine the deeply vexed relationship between religious faith and sexuality, not solely as an obstacle to be overcome, but also as a space from which we might begin to produce truly democratic forms of public engagement. What I'm attempting to do here is not so dissimilar then from what I do every time I close my eyes and bow my head to pray. That is to say, I've cheated and peeked. While I've often humbled myself, it has never been before the white man God, but instead before my kin, both the brown-skinned, round-faced people who see their history handsomely etched into my face, and for the other 8 billion or so who do not know me and who will never visit land made sacred by unheralded slaves, but who lived and died in the North Carolina Piedmont. No bother. We are all one family. It is to you, then, all of you, that I offer my fidelity and my blessing. I know how bitter the days have become. I know the suspicion that something unstoppable has arrived. I know the fear that politely friendly neighbors have turned clumsy and savage. I know the grim panic that rises up when one begins to fret that the particular vulgarities of this particularly vulgar moment are here to stay. I know the feel of paranoia itching its way ever more deeply into ripening bone. I know the rage, I know the dread, I know the loneliness, I know the shame, I know the irritation of being forced to listen to yet another old man. Counsel patience, diligence, steadfastness, and faith. Yet here I stand, counseling patience, diligence, steadfastness, and faith. Thank you ever so much.
Terrence and Debbie, would you please join me? We have a plaque. Robert, thank you.
You're welcome. How'd it go?
I think it went all right. On behalf of Terrence and Debbie, on behalf of CLAGS, congratulations. It is our privilege and our honor to award you the 2025 Kessler Lecture.
Now, do I actually do the thing?
I think we're good.
Yeah, we're good. We're just gonna drink.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right.
But you can also say
Yeah,
something if you
please.
want.
No. No, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Love you guys.
Again, I want to invite everybody downstairs to the concourse level for the reception. I also want to mention Michael Mauch's name. He's the person who made the painting on the front of the calendar in honor of Marsha P. Johnson, and I just want to say his name. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Let's go downstairs and have a drink and a bite. Thanks.